On my 70th birthday, my daughter handed me a gift. Pay for my boyfriend's college tuition, or share the dog's bed tonight. I just smiled. I knew she'd pull this stunt. Then I opened the drawer, grabbed an envelope, and set my plan in motion. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. I'm 70 years old, and I thought I'd seen every kind of cruelty life could throw at me. I was wrong. My name is Joseph, and on my 70th birthday, my daughter Claire gave me a gift I'll never forget. Not the kind you unwrap with trembling hands and grateful tears, but the kind that cuts straight through whatever's left of your heart. She walked into my living room that Tuesday afternoon with Brandon trailing behind her like a lost puppy. I was sitting in my recliner, the same one Margaret and I had picked out 23 years ago, watching the news and trying not to think about how quiet the house had become since my wife passed. Claire didn't even say happy birthday. She just stood there in her designer jeans and that expensive jacket I knew I'd probably paid for, arms crossed, wearing that expression I'd come to dread. "Dad, we need to talk," she said, not bothering to sit down. Brandon hung back by the doorway, fidgeting with his phone. 26 years old and couldn't look a man in the eye. I'd met him 3 times, and each time I liked him less. There was something about the way he looked at my house, my things, like he was already calculating their worth. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" I asked, though I could feel that familiar knot forming in my stomach. Claire only visited when she wanted something. She glanced at Brandon, who gave her some kind of encouraging nod, then looked back at me with those cold blue eyes that used to be so full of life when she was little. "Brandon got accepted into law school," she announced, like she was delivering good news. I waited for more, but she just stood there staring at me. "That's nice," I said finally. "Congratulations, son." Brandon mumbled something that might have been thanks, but Claire wasn't finished. "Tuition is $60,000 a year," she continued. "Books, living expenses, everything we need to get through 3 years. We've calculated it all out." The knot in my stomach tightened. "We? I'm supporting him, Dad, like a real partner should." She said it with this tone, like she was teaching me something important about relationships. "We need $180,000. I felt my breath catch. Not from shock exactly, but from the familiar pain of realizing your own child sees you as nothing more than a bank account. "That's a lot of money, Claire." "You have it," she said simply. "The house is paid off. You've got Mom's life insurance, your pension. You're just sitting on it while Brandon and I struggle." Baimals, I looked at this young man who couldn't meet my eyes, who'd barely spoken to me in the 6 months he'd been dating my daughter, and I wondered what kind of struggling he'd been doing. His clothes looked expensive. His car parked outside was certainly nicer than mine. "Claire," I said carefully, "that's most of what I have saved for emergencies, for medical bills, for what?" She cut me off. "You're 70, Dad. What are you saving it for? You can't take it with you." The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. This was my daughter, the little girl I'd taught to ride a bike, who used to crawl into bed with Margaret and me during thunderstorms, who'd promised to take care of me when I got old. "And if I say no?" I asked quietly. Claire's expression hardened. "Then Brandon and I will find somewhere else to live, somewhere that appreciates what we bring to the table. You can keep your money and your empty house." She paused, letting the threat sink in. "You can make your choice. Pay for Brandon's education or get used to sleeping alone with that mangy dog of yours." She was talking about Chester, my 12-year-old golden retriever, the only living thing in this house that seemed genuinely happy to see me anymore. The only family I had left who didn't see me as a burden or a resource to be exploited. I sat there in that recliner, looking at my daughter's face, and I realized something I should have understood years ago. This wasn't the first time Claire had done this to me. It was just the boldest. After Margaret died 3 years ago, Claire had shown up with tears in her eyes and empty pockets. Her apartment lease was up, she said. She was between jobs. She just needed a place to stay for a few months while she got back on her feet. I'd said yes because she was my daughter, because I was grieving, because the house felt too big and too quiet without Margaret's laughter filling it. Those few months had turned into a year and a half. Claire never looked for work, never contributed to groceries or utilities, never helped with the housework. She treated my home like a hotel with free room service. When I finally worked up the courage to ask when she might be moving out, she'd thrown such a fit that I backed down immediately. Margaret would have handled it better. Margaret had always been better at seeing through Claire's manipulations. Then last spring, Claire had met Brandon at some party, and suddenly she was moving out. Not because she'd found independence, but because she'd found someone else to support her. Someone younger, someone with more potential earning power, someone stupider. I'd been relieved at first. Finally, my house was mine again. But Claire's visits had become increasingly focused on what I could provide for her new life. First, it was help with the security deposit on their apartment. Then it was money for Claire's car repairs, for Brandon's computer, for their vacation to Florida. Always emergencies, always urgent, always accompanied by subtle threats about how seldom they visited, how lonely I must be, how much I needed them in my life. But this birthday demand was different. This wasn't asking for help with a few $1,000s. This was asking for my future, my security, my ability to live independently as I aged. This was asking me to choose between my financial survival and my emotional survival. I looked at my daughter standing there in my living room, beautiful and cold and absolutely certain that I would cave in like I always did. Brandon was checking his phone again, probably calculating how long this was taking. "I need to think about it," I said finally. Claire's face flushed with anger. "Think about what? This is Brandon's future we're talking about. Our future. Don't you want me to be happy?" It was the same question she'd been asking me since she was 16. "Don't you want me to be happy, Dad?" Usually asked right before she requested money for something she absolutely had to have. Some emergency that couldn't wait, some opportunity that would slip away if I didn't act immediately. "Of course I want you to be happy," I said. "But—" "No buts," Claire interrupted. "Yes or no, Dad? Are you going to help your daughter, or are you going to let your own selfishness destroy our relationship?" I stood up slowly, my joints protesting after sitting for so long. Chester lifted his head from his bed by the fireplace, sensing the tension in the room. "I said I need to think about it," I repeated. Claire exchanged another look with Brandon, this one frustrated and calculating. "Fine," she said curtly, "but don't take too long. Brandon needs to respond to the law school by next week." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "You know, Mom would have said yes immediately. She understood what family meant." The words hit their target perfectly. Claire had always known exactly how to weaponize my grief, my guilt, my love for Margaret against me. After they left, I sat back down in my recliner and stared at the empty room. Chester padded over and rested his head on my knee, those wise brown eyes full of concern. But here's what Claire didn't know, what she couldn't have known because she'd stopped really seeing me as a person years ago. I wasn't the same broken widower who'd let her walk all over me after Margaret's funeral. I wasn't the same desperate father who'd been so afraid of losing his daughter's love that he'd enabled her worst impulses. I reached into the drawer of the side table next to my chair and pulled out a manila envelope. It was thick, heavy with the weight of truth. I'd been preparing for this conversation for months, maybe years, because deep down, I'd always known this day would come. I'd known that Claire's demands would eventually escalate to something I couldn't give, something that would force me to choose between my daughter's manipulation and my own survival. The envelope contained things Claire thought I'd never discover, things she assumed I was too old or too trusting to uncover. But she'd underestimated me. She'd forgotten that before I retired, I'd spent 35 years as an accountant, 35 years of learning how to read between the lines, how to spot discrepancies, how to follow money trails that people thought they'd hidden. I'd been watching, I'd been listening, I'd been learning. And tomorrow, when Claire came back expecting my answer, expecting my surrender, I was going to show her exactly what was in this envelope. Chester whined softly, as if he could sense the storm that was coming. I scratched behind his ears and smiled for the first time in months. "Don't worry, old boy," I whispered. "We're going to be just fine." The morning after my birthday ultimatum, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't anxious about Claire's expectations or guilty about disappointing her. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Margaret died. Purpose. Chester and I had our usual breakfast routine, scrambled eggs for me, kibble and a bit of bacon for him, while I thought about how to handle what was coming. Claire would be back today, expecting an answer, expecting me to hand over nearly $200,000 like it was pocket change. What she didn't expect was that I'd spent the last 8 months investigating her life. It had started innocently enough. After Claire moved in with Brandon, she'd posted constantly on social media about their new apartment, their dinner dates, their weekend trips. I'd only joined Facebook to see pictures of her, to feel connected to the daughter who barely called anymore. But the more I looked at her photos, the more questions I had. Claire had told me she was unemployed, struggling to find work in her field. She'd said Brandon was barely scraping by as a part-time tutor while he prepared for law school applications. They needed help with rent, with groceries, with basic necessities. Over the past year, I'd given them nearly $15,000 for various emergencies. But the photos told a different story. I walked over to my desk and pulled out a folder I'd been keeping, full of printed screenshots from Claire's Instagram and Facebook accounts. Here was Claire at an expensive restaurant downtown, cocktails that cost $18 each lined up in front of her. Here was Brandon wearing a watch that cost more than my monthly pension check. Here was their apartment, which definitely wasn't the modest one-bedroom Claire had described to me. In one photo, Claire was holding shopping bags from stores I couldn't afford to shop at, even when I was working full-time. The caption read, "Treating myself because I deserve it." I'd saved that one to my phone and stared at it for a long time. She'd posted it the same week she'd called me crying, asking for $500 to help with Brandon's car payment. But the social media investigation was just the beginning. What really opened my eyes was what I discovered when I started paying attention to the details Claire thought I was too old to notice. 3 months ago, she'd come to visit wearing a designer purse I recognized from Margaret's shopping trips. I knew it cost over $800 because Margaret had admired it once, but decided it was too expensive. When I'd asked Claire about it, she'd laughed and said she'd found it at a thrift store for $20. That was when I decided to do something I'd never done before in my life. I hired a private investigator. His name was Tom Mitchell, a retired police detective who specialized in background checks and surveillance. I'd found him online, read reviews from other clients, and made an appointment. Sitting in his small office above a pizza shop downtown, I'd felt ridiculous explaining that I wanted to investigate my own daughter. "Mr. Holloway," Tom had said, leaning back in his chair, "you'd be surprised how often I get calls like this. Adult children taking advantage of elderly parents is more common than people think." He'd been professional, thorough, and discreet. For $1,200, he'd given me a complete picture of Claire and Brandon's real life. What he found made my blood run cold. First, the apartment. Claire had told me they were renting a modest place for $900 a month. In reality, they were living in a luxury complex with a pool, gym, and 24-hour concierge service. The rent was $2,800 a month, and it was being paid by someone named Marcus Webb. Tom had dug deeper into Marcus Webb. 42 years old, divorced, owned 3 successful restaurants in the city, and according to the investigator's surveillance photos, Marcus was spending a lot of time at Claire and Brandon's apartment when Brandon wasn't there. "Your daughter appears to be in a relationship with both men simultaneously," Tom had told me during our final meeting. The younger man, Brandon, seems unaware of the older man's involvement. She's essentially running a con on both of them. The photos were damning. Claire leaving expensive hotels with Marcus on Tuesday afternoons. Claire and Marcus having intimate dinners while Brandon was supposedly at his tutoring job. Claire wearing jewelry that Marcus had clearly bought for her, jewelry she'd never worn when visiting me. But the financial investigation was what really broke my heart. Tom had discovered that Claire had 3 different bank accounts, all with significant balances. The money I'd been giving her for emergencies was going into a savings account she'd labeled Future Fund. She wasn't struggling. She wasn't desperate. She was stockpiling money from multiple sources and lying to everyone involved. The law school story was also a fabrication. Tom had contacted the admissions office at the school Brandon had supposedly been accepted to. They had no record of anyone by his name even applying, let alone being accepted. The whole thing was an elaborate lie designed to extract the largest sum possible from me, but perhaps the most painful discovery was what Tom found when he looked into Claire's employment history. She'd told me she'd been laid off from her marketing job and couldn't find new work. In reality, she'd quit her job 8 months ago after receiving a settlement from a workplace injury lawsuit. The settlement was for $43,000, money she'd never mentioned to me. She didn't need my help. She'd never needed my help. Every sob story, every emergency, every desperate phone call had been calculated manipulation designed to separate me from my money while she lived a secret life of luxury funded by lies. I sat at my kitchen table now, looking through Tom's report one more time, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Absolute clarity about who my daughter really was. The Brandon situation was even worse than I'd imagined. Tom's investigation revealed that Brandon wasn't just naive, he was actively involved in some of Claire's schemes. He'd been helping her create fake rental agreements and utility bills to show me when she needed emergency money. He'd even coached her on what to say during her tearful phone calls, asking for help. But here's what neither Claire nor Brandon knew. Tom had also uncovered something about Brandon's past that even Claire wasn't aware of. Brandon wasn't just some struggling young man trying to better himself through education. He was a con artist with a criminal record. 2 arrests for fraud in the past 5 years, both involving elderly victims. In one case, he'd convinced a 74-year-old widow to give him $25,000 for a fake investment opportunity. In another, he'd romance scammed a retired teacher out of her entire pension fund. The pattern was always the same. Find vulnerable older people, gain their trust, create elaborate stories about opportunities or emergencies, then disappear with their money. Claire thought she was using Brandon to help manipulate me. She had no idea that Brandon was using her to get access to a bigger target than he'd ever had before. A lonely widower with substantial savings and a daughter who could provide the perfect cover for his operation. The law school con wasn't just about getting money from me. According to Tom's research, Brandon had used similar stories with at least 3 other families in the past 2 years. Always the same script: acceptance to law school, need for immediate tuition money, promises of future success, and repayment that never materialized. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. Chester was lying at my feet, completely unaware that our quiet life was about to explode into chaos. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Claire's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice artificially bright. "I hope you've had time to think about our conversation yesterday." "I have," I said simply. "And?" The brightness faded slightly, replaced by an edge of impatience. "I'd like you and Brandon to come over this afternoon. We need to discuss this properly." There was a pause. "Okay, but Dad, I hope you understand how important this is. Brandon's future depends on your decision." I almost laughed. Brandon's future. If only she knew what Brandon's real future looked like. "I understand perfectly," I said. "Come by around 3 o'clock. And Claire? Make sure Brandon comes with you. This concerns both of you." After I hung up, I went to my bedroom and opened the safe where I kept important documents. Inside, along with Margaret's jewelry and our insurance papers, was the manila envelope I'd shown Claire yesterday. But there was also a second envelope, thicker than the first, containing everything Tom Mitchell had uncovered. In 4 hours, my daughter was going to walk into my house expecting to leave with a promise of nearly $200,000. Instead, she was going to discover that her 70-year-old father knew everything, every lie, every manipulation, every secret she thought she'd hidden from the foolish old man who loved her. I placed both envelopes on my desk and went to make lunch. Chester followed me to the kitchen, tail wagging, completely trusting that everything would work out fine. I wished I had his confidence, because what was coming this afternoon wasn't just a confrontation with my daughter, it was the end of the relationship we'd pretended to have for years, and the beginning of something I wasn't sure either of us was prepared for. But I was tired of being afraid of Claire's anger, tired of being manipulated by my own guilt, tired of enabling someone who saw my love as a weakness to be exploited. At 70 years old, I was finally ready to fight back. At exactly 3 o'clock, I heard Claire's car pulled into my driveway. Through the living room window, I watched her and Brandon get out, both of them moving with the confident swagger of people who believed they were about to win a substantial victory. Claire was carrying a leather portfolio, probably filled with fake documents about Brandon's supposed law school acceptance, and Brandon had cleaned himself up for the occasion, wearing khakis and a button-down shirt that made him look almost respectable. They had no idea what was waiting for them inside. I opened the door before they could knock, gesturing them into the living room where I'd arranged 3 chairs in a triangle. The 2 manila envelopes sat on the coffee table between us, innocent-looking but loaded with enough truth to destroy everything Claire thought she knew about her carefully constructed lies. "Dad, you look serious," Claire said, settling into her chair with that practiced smile she used when she wanted something. "I hope you've made the right decision." Brandon nodded eagerly, leaning forward like an overeager student. "Mr. Holloway, I want you to know how much this means to me, to us. I'll pay back every penny once I'm established in my law career." I looked at this young man who had probably never told the truth about anything significant in his life, who was sitting in my living room planning to steal my life savings, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. "Before we discuss money," I said, "I think we should talk about honesty." Claire's smile flickered slightly. "What do you mean?" I reached for the first envelope and opened it slowly, pulling out a stack of printed photographs. "I mean these pictures from your social media accounts, Claire." I spread them across the coffee table like playing cards. Claire at expensive restaurants, Brandon wearing his expensive watch, their luxury apartment with its marble countertops and city view. Claire's designer purse, the one she'd claimed cost $20 at a thrift store. Claire's face went pale, but she recovered quickly. "Dad, what is this? Have you been spying on me?" "I've been paying attention," I said calmly. "Something I should have done a long time ago." Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting between the photos and the door as if calculating whether he could make a run for it. "These photos were taken over the past 8 months, I continued. "The same 8 months you've been telling me you're struggling financially, that you can barely afford rent and groceries." "Those are just occasional treats," Claire said, her voice rising slightly. "Everyone deserves to have some fun now and then." I picked up one particular photo and held it toward her. "This dinner cost more than I spend on groceries in a month. You posted it the same day you called me asking for money to help with your electric bill." Claire's jaw tightened. "I don't like what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," I said. "I'm stating facts." I reached for the second envelope, and I have more facts to share. The private investigator's report was thick, professional, and devastating. I pulled out the first section and set it on the table. "This is a financial background check on both of you," I said. "Claire, did you know that Brandon has been arrested twice for defrauding elderly people?" Brandon's face went white. Claire turned to stare at him, confusion and horror warring in her expression. "What?" she whispered. I read from Tom's report. "Brandon Mitchell," yes, Claire, his real last name is Mitchell, not Morrison like he told you, was arrested in 2021 for convincing a 74-year-old widow named Eleanor Parks to invest $25,000 in a fake real estate development project. Brandon started to stand up. "This is ridiculous. I don't have to listen to this." "Sit down," I said sharply, using the voice I'd once used when Claire was a teenager trying to sneak out past curfew. To my surprise, he sat. "In 2022, I continued, he was arrested again for romance fraud, stealing the entire pension fund of a retired teacher named Dorothy Chen, $43,000. Claire was staring at Brandon with growing horror. "Is this true?" Brandon opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face had gone from pale to gray. "The law school acceptance is also fake," I said, pulling out another document. "I had my investigator contact the admissions office. They have no record of anyone named Brandon Morrison or Brandon Mitchell even applying to their program." Claire's breathing became shallow. "Brandon? And here's something else interesting," I said, reaching for another section of the report. "Claire, You told me you've been unemployed for months, that you can't find work. But you received a $43,000 settlement from your previous employer 8 months ago. Money you never mentioned to me. The silence in the room was deafening. Claire looked like someone had slapped her. You also have 3 different bank accounts with a combined balance of over $60,000, I continued, including an account labeled Future Fund, where you've been depositing the money I've given you for emergencies. Brandon suddenly found his voice. Claire, what the hell? You told me you were broke. I turned to him. And you told her you were accepted to law school. I guess you're both liars. Claire's shock was giving way to anger. Dad, even if some of this is true, it doesn't change the fact that you're my father, and I need your help. Help with what? I asked. You don't need tuition money because Brandon isn't going to law school. You don't need rent money because your apartment is being paid for by someone named Marcus Webb. Claire's face went completely white. How do you? A 42-year-old restaurant owner who you've been seeing while Brandon is at work, I continued. Or should I say, while Brandon is pretending to be at work, since he doesn't actually have a job. Brandon turned to Claire with fury in his eyes. You're cheating on me? Oh, that's rich, Claire snapped back. You're a criminal who's been planning to rob my father, and you're upset that I'm seeing someone else? They started arguing, their voices rising, their carefully constructed partnership dissolving into accusations and blame. I sat back and watched 2 people who had planned to steal nearly $200,000 from me turn on each other like rabid dogs. But I wasn't finished. There's more, I said loudly enough to cut through their argument. They both turned to look at me, their faces flushed with anger and fear. I pulled out the final section of Tom's report. Brandon, this pattern of yours, targeting elderly people through their adult children, it's not new. You've done this at least 3 times in the past 2 years, I read from the investigator's notes. The Peterson family in Denver, you convinced their daughter Sarah that you needed money for medical school, $28,000. The Williams family in Phoenix, you told their son Michael you needed startup capital for a tech business, $35,000. Brandon was shaking now, all pretense gone. Stop. In each case, you found a vulnerable adult child who had access to elderly parents with money. You created relationships, built trust, fabricated emergencies, and disappeared with their savings. Claire was staring at Brandon like she'd never seen him before. You were using me. And you were using me, Brandon shot back, with your secret sugar daddy paying your rent while you bled money from your father. The difference, I said, standing up slowly, is that Claire is my daughter. You're a predator who has systematically destroyed families for profit. I walked to the window and looked out at my quiet street, at the life I'd built with Margaret, at the peace I was about to lose forever. Here's what's going to happen, I said, turning back to face them. Brandon, you're going to leave my house right now and never contact Claire or me again. If you refuse, I'm calling the police and showing them everything in this report. Brandon's hands were trembling. You can't prove anything. I reached into the envelope one more time and pulled out a small digital recorder. Actually, I can. Tom planted a recording device in your apartment 3 weeks ago. We have hours of you and Claire discussing how to manipulate me, how to make your stories more convincing, how to get the maximum amount of money possible. The blood drained from both their faces. We have recordings of you coaching Claire on what to say during her tearful phone calls. We have recordings of you researching my financial situation, planning how to convince me to give you access to my accounts. I set the recorder on the table between us. We also have recordings of Brandon calling other potential targets, using the same scripts he used on you, Claire. Brandon stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is entrapment or something. It's illegal. Actually, it's not, I said. I consulted with a lawyer before taking any of these steps. Everything we've done is perfectly legal. Claire finally found her voice. Dad, I know this looks bad, but it doesn't look bad, Claire. It is bad. You've been systematically lying to me, stealing from me, and manipulating my grief over your mother's death to fund a lifestyle you can't afford. Tears started streaming down her face, but I felt nothing. After years of being manipulated by her crying, I'd finally reached the point where her tears couldn't touch me. But I'm still your daughter, she whispered. I looked at this woman who shared my DNA but had become a stranger, this person who had spent months planning to steal my future, my security, my ability to live independently in my old age. "No," I said quietly. "A daughter wouldn't do this to her father." Brandon was already moving toward the door, but Claire remained seated, staring at me with a mixture of shock and desperate calculation. "You can't just cut me off," she said. "I'm family." I sat back down and met her eyes. Family doesn't lie. Family doesn't steal. Family doesn't conspire with criminals to defraud their own father. "But what am I supposed to do now?" she asked. And for a moment, she sounded like the little girl she used to be. "I suggest you figure that out the same way everyone else does," I said. "With honesty, hard work, and without stealing from people who love you." Brandon had reached the front door, but Claire wasn't moving. She sat there staring at me, and I could see her mind working, trying to find some angle, some manipulation that might still salvage this situation. But there wasn't one. For the first time in her adult life, Claire had been completely outmaneuvered by the old man she'd thought was too naive to see through her lies. What she did next would determine whether we ever spoke again. Claire didn't leave quietly. After Brandon slammed the front door behind him, she sat in my living room for another 20 minutes, cycling through every manipulation technique she'd perfected over the years. First came the tears, accompanied by promises that she would change, that she'd never lie to me again, that Brandon had corrupted her, and she was really a victim in all of this. When crying didn't work, she tried anger. How dare I spy on her? How could I trust some stranger's investigation over my own daughter's word? Didn't I understand that everyone made mistakes, that she was still young and learning? When anger failed, she shifted to guilt. Mom would be ashamed of me for treating her this way. Mom had always believed in forgiveness, in family loyalty. Was I really going to destroy our relationship over money? Finally, she tried bargaining. She didn't need the full $180,000. Maybe we could work out a payment plan. Maybe she could pay me back with interest. Maybe I could just help with half the amount. Through it all, I sat quietly in my recliner, Chester at my feet, waiting for her to exhaust herself. I'd heard all of these arguments before, in various forms, over the years. The only difference was that now I knew exactly what they were, the calculated manipulation of a woman who had turned lying into an art form. When she finally realized that nothing was working, that I wasn't going to budge, her mask slipped completely. "Fine," she said, standing up and smoothing her expensive jeans. "You want to be stubborn and selfish? You want to choose money over your own daughter? That's your choice, Dad. But don't expect me to just disappear quietly." "What do you mean by that?" I asked. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I mean, you're not the only family member who cares about Brandon's future. I mean, there are other people who might be interested in helping us, especially when they hear how cruelly you've treated me." My stomach tightened. "Claire, Uncle Robert always said I was his favorite niece," she continued, referring to my younger brother. "And Aunt Susan has always thought you were too selfish with your money. Cousin David, Cousin Michelle, they all have opinions about how you've been hoarding Mom's life insurance while your own daughter struggles." I felt a familiar chill run down my spine. Claire was threatening to turn the entire family against me, to spread her lies to people who didn't know the truth about what she'd become. "They'll be very interested to hear how you hired a private investigator to spy on me," she said, slinging her purse over her shoulder. "How you invaded my privacy, violated my trust, chose some stranger's lies over your own daughter's word." "Those aren't lies, Claire. You know they aren't." She shrugged. "Truth is whatever people believe, Dad. And I've always been better at telling stories than you have." After she left, I sat in the gathering darkness of my living room, not bothering to turn on the lights. Chester sensed my mood and climbed onto the couch beside me, pressing his warm body against my leg. I knew Claire would follow through on her threat. She'd done it before, on a smaller scale. When I'd questioned her about some inconsistencies in her stories, she'd called my sister-in-law Susan and painted me as a paranoid old man who was becoming suspicious and controlling in his grief. Susan had called me later, gently suggesting that maybe I was being too hard on Claire, that everyone grieved differently, that I should be grateful to have a daughter who wanted to stay close to me. That conversation had made me doubt myself so much that I'd apologized to Claire and given her another $2,000 for her car repairs. But this time would be different. This time she wasn't dealing with vague accusations or minor inconsistencies. This time I had evidence, documentation, proof of everything she'd done. The question was whether my family would be willing to look at the evidence or whether they'd prefer to believe Claire's version of events. I didn't have to wait long to find out. The first call came that evening, just as I was settling down for dinner. My brother Robert's name appeared on my phone screen. "Joe," he said without preamble, "what the hell is going on with Claire?" I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "What did she tell you?" "She's here crying her eyes out, saying you've disowned her, that you hired some detective to follow her around and invade her privacy. She says you've accused her boyfriend of being a criminal based on some fake investigation." "The investigation isn't fake, Robert." "Come on, Joe. I know you've been struggling since Margaret died, but this paranoid behavior—" "I'm not paranoid," I interrupted. "I have documentation of everything. Brandon has a criminal record. Claire has been lying about her financial situation for months." There was a pause. "Joe, listen to yourself. You're talking about conspiracy theories about your own daughter plotting against you. Don't you think grief might be affecting your judgment?" And there it was. Claire had positioned herself as the victim and me as the unstable elderly man whose grief had made him paranoid and cruel. It was brilliant, actually. Who would believe that a sweet daughter would systematically defraud her grieving father? Who would believe that a young man who seemed so devoted to his girlfriend was actually a professional con artist? "Robert, I can send you the investigator's report. I can show you the evidence." "I don't need to see some private eyes made-up stories," Robert said firmly. "I know Claire. I've known her since she was born. She's not perfect, but she's not some criminal mastermind either." "Once. Have you given her money recently?" I asked. The silence on the other end of the phone was telling. "That's different," Robert said finally. "She needed help with her security deposit." "How much?" "That's not your business." "How much, Robert?" Another pause. $3,000, but she's going to pay it back." I felt sick. "When did she ask you for this money?" "Last month. She said she was moving in with this guy Brandon, that they'd found a great apartment but needed help with the upfront costs." "Last month? The same time she'd been asking me for money for grocery emergencies and utility bills? The same time she'd been living in an apartment paid for by Marcus Webb and stockpiling money in her secret accounts?" "Robert, she's been lying to both of us. She's been telling you one story, telling me another story, while living a completely different life. Joe, you need to stop this. You're destroying your relationship with your daughter over what? Pride? Stubbornness? Some need to control her life." I realized then that Claire had played this perfectly. She'd probably been laying the groundwork for weeks, calling family members with subtle complaints about my behavior, my mood, my increasing paranoia since Margaret's death. By the time she showed up at Robert's house in tears, he was already primed to see me as the villain. "I'm going to hang up now," Robert said, "but I want you to think about what you're doing. Claire is all the family you have left, Joe. Don't let your grief destroy that." The line went dead. Over the next 3 days, I received similar calls from Susan, from my cousin David, from Margaret's sister, Linda. The story was always the same. Claire was devastated. I was behaving irrationally. Everyone was concerned about my mental state. No one wanted to see the evidence. No one was interested in hearing my side of the story. They'd all decided that a grief-stricken old man had become paranoid and controlling, and that poor Claire was the victim of his delusions. The worst call came from my nephew Paul, Margaret's sister's son, whom I'd always been close to. "Uncle Joe," he said, "I'm worried about you. Aunt Claire says you've been acting strange since Aunt Margaret died, that you're becoming suspicious of everyone around you." Aunt Claire. She'd convinced my nephew to call her aunt, as if she were his elder, as if she were the mature family member looking out for everyone's best interests. "Paul, I can prove everything I've told you about Claire and Brandon." "Uncle Joe, even if some of it's true, does it really matter? So maybe Claire made some mistakes. Maybe she wasn't completely honest about her situation. Does that mean you should cut her off completely? She was planning to steal nearly $200,000 from me. She was asking for help with her boyfriend's education. That's not stealing, that's family. I hung up without saying goodbye. That night, I sat in my living room with Chester, surrounded by the evidence of my daughter's betrayal, and I realized that Claire had won this round. She'd successfully turned my entire family against me. They all believed I was a paranoid old man who had chosen money over love, who had become cruel and suspicious in my grief. None of them wanted to hear the truth. None of them were willing to consider that sweet, troubled Claire might be capable of systematic manipulation and fraud. But I wasn't finished fighting. If Claire thought she could destroy my reputation, isolate me from my family, and pressure me into giving her what she wanted, she had underestimated me again. I had one more card to play, one piece of information that even Tom Mitchell's investigation hadn't uncovered. Something I'd discovered on my own. Something that would change everything. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. It was time to make a call that would shift the balance of power permanently. "Detective Morrison," a voice answered on the second ring. "Detective, this is Joseph Holloway. I need to report a crime." What I was about to do would change everything between Claire and me forever. But she'd made her choice when she decided to turn my family against me. Now it was time for her to face the consequences of years of lies, manipulation, and fraud. The war Claire had started was about to become very real. Detective Morrison arrived at my house the next morning with a younger officer I didn't recognize. I'd barely slept, knowing that what I was about to do would cross a line I could never uncross. But Claire had forced my hand when she turned my family against me. If she wanted to play hardball, I would show her what hardball really looked like. "Mr. Holloway," Detective Morrison said as I led them into my living room, "you mentioned on the phone that you wanted to report fraud and elder abuse." I gestured for them to sit down and placed Tom Mitchell's complete investigative report on the coffee table between us. "My daughter and her boyfriend have been systematically defrauding me for over a year. Yesterday, they demanded $180,000 for fake law school tuition." The younger officer, whose nameplate read Patterson, opened his notebook. "Can you walk us through the details?" For the next hour, I laid out everything. The fake emergencies, the manipulated bank accounts, Brandon's criminal history, the elaborate law school con. I showed them the recordings Tom had made, the financial documents proving Claire's lies about her employment and income, the evidence of Brandon's pattern of targeting elderly victims through their adult children. Detective Morrison studied the photographs of Claire and Brandon, cross-referencing them with information on his laptop. "We've been tracking this Brandon Mitchell for 6 months, he said finally. "He's wanted in connection with 3 other cases of elder fraud in neighboring states." My heart sank. Despite everything, hearing that my daughter had been involved with someone the police were actively hunting made me feel sick. "Mr. Holloway," Patterson said gently, "I need to ask you directly. Do you want to press charges against your daughter as well as Mr. Mitchell?" I stared at the question hanging in the air between us. Pressing charges against Brandon was easy. He was a stranger, a predator who had targeted my family. But Claire was my daughter. Despite everything she'd done, despite the lies and manipulation and betrayal, she was still the little girl I'd taught to ride a bike, still the child I'd loved unconditionally for 32 years. "I need to think about that," I said. Detective Morrison nodded. "We have enough evidence to arrest Mitchell immediately. We'll need you to come to the station later to file a formal complaint, but we can pick him up today." After the police left, I sat alone with Chester, staring at my phone. I knew I should feel victorious. I'd outmaneuvered Claire's manipulation, gathered evidence of her crimes, and taken steps to protect myself from further abuse, but all I felt was empty. My phone rang, Claire's name on the screen. "Dad," she said without preamble, "we need to talk. I think we've said everything that needs to be said. Brandon's gone." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "He left this morning, took everything of value from our apartment, and disappeared." I wasn't surprised. Tom's investigation had shown that Brandon always abandoned his cons the moment they became complicated or risky. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you?" Claire's voice hardened. "Because I think you planned this. I think you scared him away on purpose." "Claire, don't," she interrupted. "I know what you did. Brandon told me about his past before he left. He said you probably called the police, that you were vindictive enough to destroy his life just to punish me. I said nothing. Let her believe what she wanted to believe. So congratulations, Dad. You won. You broke us up, you humiliated me in front of the family, and now I'm alone with nowhere to go, because Marcus found out about Brandon and cut me off too. Despite everything, I felt a flicker of concern. Where are you staying? That's not your problem anymore, is it? Claire's voice cracked slightly. You made it very clear that I'm not your daughter anymore. Claire, you're always my daughter. But what I did was ask my father for help when I needed it. What you did was hire strangers to destroy my life. The conversation was going in circles, just like every conversation we'd had for years. Claire would never accept responsibility for her actions. She would never acknowledge that her lies and manipulation had consequences. In her mind, she would always be the victim, and I would always be the cruel father who chose money over love. I have to go, she said abruptly. But this isn't over, Dad. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've lost. The line went dead. That afternoon, I drove to the police station to file my formal complaint against Brandon. Detective Morrison met me in an interview room with a stack of paperwork and a recording device. We picked up Mitchell this morning, he said. He was trying to board a bus to Florida with a suitcase full of cash and jewelry. We found items we believe were stolen from multiple victims, including some pieces that belonged to your daughter's apartment. What do you mean? He cleaned out their place before he left, took everything of value, including some jewelry and electronics that your daughter had probably bought with money she'd gotten from you or other sources. So Brandon had betrayed Claire just as thoroughly as she'd betrayed me. There was a certain poetic justice in that, though it didn't make me feel any better. Mr. Holloway, Detective Morrison continued, Mitchell is talking. He's trying to negotiate a plea deal by providing information about his other victims and accomplices. My stomach clenched. Accomplices? He claims your daughter was a willing participant in the scheme to defraud you. According to his statement, she recruited him specifically because she knew you had substantial savings and would be vulnerable to manipulation after your wife's death. The words hit me like a physical blow. Bad enough that Claire had been manipulated by a con artist. But if Brandon was telling the truth, she hadn't been a victim at all. She'd been a collaborator, actively working to destroy her own father's financial security. He also says she has connections to other potential targets, Detective Morrison continued, elderly relatives, family friends, people she could provide access to for future cons. I thought about my brother Robert, who'd given Claire $3,000, about my cousin David, who'd always been soft-hearted when it came to family sob stories, about Margaret's sister Linda, who had a substantial inheritance from her late husband. Detective, I said slowly, what would happen if I decided to press charges against Claire as well? He leaned back in his chair. Based on the evidence you've provided and Mitchell's statement, we could charge her with conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and theft. If convicted, she could face significant jail time. I stared at the papers in front of me, my signature required, on multiple lines. Signing them would mean sending my own daughter to prison. Not signing them would mean allowing her to continue targeting vulnerable people, possibly including other members of my own family. I need more time to think about this, I said. I understand. But Mr. Holloway, you should know that we've identified at least 2 other families that Mitchell and your daughter approached together. The pattern is always the same. She makes contact with elderly relatives, gains their trust, then introduces Mitchell as her boyfriend who needs financial help for some fabricated emergency. The scope of Claire's betrayal kept expanding. This wasn't just about stealing from me. She'd turned manipulation into a business, using her charm and family connections to identify and exploit vulnerable people. Take your time, Detective Morrison said, but don't take too long. Mitchell's cooperation is contingent on us moving quickly on all related charges. I drove home in a daze, Chester waiting for me at the front door with his usual enthusiasm. At least someone in my life was still pure, still honest, still capable of unconditional love. That evening, as I sat in my recliner trying to process everything I'd learned, my phone rang, an unknown number. Mr. Holloway? The voice was unfamiliar, female, nervous. My name is Dorothy Chen. Detective Morrison gave me your number. Dorothy Chen. The retired teacher Brandon had defrauded for $43,000. I hope you don't mind me calling, she continued. The detective said you might be pressing charges against the man who stole from both of us. I'm considering it, I said carefully. I wanted to thank you. When they arrested him this morning, they recovered some of my mother's jewelry that he'd stolen along with the money. I thought I'd never see those pieces again. I'm glad you got them back. Mr. Holloway, I also wanted to tell you something about your daughter. My grip tightened on the phone. What about her? She came to see me 3 weeks ago, said she was worried about you, that you were showing signs of dementia and making poor financial decisions. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to testify about how Brandon had taken advantage of my confusion and age-related decline. The blood drained from my face. What did you tell her? I told her the truth, that I wasn't confused when Brandon stole from me, that I was a victim of deliberate fraud, not age-related vulnerability. But Mr. Holloway, I think she was building a case to have you declared incompetent. The room spun around me. Claire hadn't just been planning to steal my money through emotional manipulation. She'd been laying the groundwork to have me declared mentally incompetent so she could gain legal control of my finances. She asked very specific questions about my experience, Dorothy continued, about whether I'd noticed any memory problems before Brandon approached me, whether my family had been concerned about my decision-making abilities. It felt like she was trying to establish a pattern. After Dorothy hung up, I sat in my living room as the full scope of Claire's plan became clear. The family members she'd been calling, turning against me. She hadn't just been seeking emotional support or trying to pressure me into giving her money. She'd been building a narrative of my declining mental state, gathering potential witnesses who could testify that I'd become paranoid, suspicious, and incapable of making rational financial decisions. If her manipulation and theft hadn't worked, her backup plan was to have me declared incompetent and gain control of my assets through legal guardianship. My own daughter had been planning to steal my freedom along with my money. I reached for my phone and dialed Detective Morrison's number. Detective, this is Joseph Holloway. I've made my decision about pressing charges against my daughter. What's your decision, Mr. Holloway? I looked around my living room at the pictures of Margaret on the mantelpiece, at Chester sleeping peacefully by the fireplace, at the quiet life Claire had been planning to destroy. I want to press full charges, I said, against both of them. 6 months later, I was sitting in my garden on a warm October morning, watching Chester chase squirrels with the boundless energy of a dog half his age. The morning sun felt good on my face, and for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. The legal proceedings had been swift and decisive. Brandon was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for multiple counts of elder fraud across 3 states. Claire received 3 years for conspiracy and elder abuse, though she'd been released on parole after 18 months, with strict conditions including mandatory therapy and community service. The day of Claire's sentencing had been the hardest of my life. Watching my daughter led away in handcuffs, seeing the shock and disbelief on her face as she finally faced real consequences for her actions. It broke something in me that I'm not sure will ever fully heal. But it also freed me from something I'd been carrying for too long, the responsibility for fixing someone who didn't want to be fixed. The family fallout had been immediate and brutal. Robert refused to speak to me for 3 months, convinced I'd sent an innocent girl to prison out of spite and paranoia. Susan had organized a family meeting to discuss having me evaluated for competency, exactly as Claire had planned. Cousin David had called me a bitter old man who'd chosen revenge over forgiveness. But truth has a way of surfacing even when people don't want to see it. The first crack in their certainty came when Detective Morrison contacted each family member Claire had approached, explaining the full scope of her criminal activities. Robert discovered that the $3,000 he'd given Claire for her security deposit had been deposited into the same secret account where she'd been stockpiling money stolen from multiple sources. Susan learned that Claire had asked detailed questions about her husband's retirement accounts and investment portfolio. Questions that made much more sense in the context of a systematic fraud scheme than casual family conversation. Linda, Margaret's sister, revealed that Claire had been pressing her for information about elderly friends who lived alone and might be vulnerable to scams. Information Claire claimed she needed to help protect them. One by one, my family members began to see the pattern they'd been blind to before. Claire hadn't been a loving daughter unfairly persecuted by a paranoid father. She'd been a predator who'd used family connections to identify and exploit vulnerable targets. The hardest conversation was with my nephew Paul, who called me 4 months after Claire's sentencing. "Uncle Joe," he said, his voice thick with shame, "I owe you an apology. Claire approached me about investing in a business opportunity with Brandon. She said you were being unreasonably cautious about money and that I shouldn't mention it to you because it would just make you worry unnecessarily." "How much did she ask for?" $15,000. I was going to give it to her until Brandon got arrested and the whole scheme fell apart. $15,000 from Paul, $3,000 from Robert. God knows how much from other family members and friends she'd been cultivating. Claire's operation had been far more extensive than even Tom Mitchell's investigation had revealed. But the most meaningful conversation came from an unexpected source. Margaret's sister, Linda, called me on a rainy Tuesday in September, her voice soft and apologetic. "Joe, I've been thinking about something Margaret said to me about 6 months before she died." I set down my coffee cup, giving her my full attention. "She was worried about Claire," Linda continued. "She said Claire had become manipulative and demanding, that she was always asking for money and getting angry when Margaret questioned her spending. Margaret was afraid that after she was gone, Claire would take advantage of your grief. Margaret never said anything to me about that. She didn't want to burden you while you were dealing with her illness. But Joe, she made me promise to watch out for you, to make sure Claire didn't—" Linda's voice broke. "I'm so sorry. I should have paid attention. I should have supported you instead of believing Claire's lies." That conversation helped heal something in me I hadn't realized was broken. Margaret had seen what was coming. She'd tried to protect me, even while she was dying. And now, finally, I'd found the strength to protect myself the way she would have wanted me to. The financial recovery was easier than I'd expected. Most of the money Claire had stolen was recovered during the investigation. The secret accounts were frozen, and their contents returned to the victims. Even some of the money she'd given to Brandon was recovered when they found his stash of cash and stolen goods. More importantly, I'd learned to recognize and resist manipulation in all its forms. When Robert eventually called to apologize, asking if I could help him pay for his grandson's college tuition because times were tough, I politely declined and suggested he apply for financial aid like everyone else. When Susan hinted that she could use assistance with her property taxes, I offered to help her find resources in the community, but made it clear I wouldn't be writing any checks. The difference was that these requests felt different, less desperate, less manipulative, more respectful of my right to say no. My family had learned that I was no longer an easy target, and our relationships had become healthier as a result. But the most unexpected gift came from Dorothy Chen, the retired teacher Brandon had defrauded. She started calling me every few weeks just to check in and chat. We discovered we had similar interests: crossword puzzles, classic movies, gardening. Our conversations were easy and honest, free from the tension and calculation that had defined my interactions with Claire for so long. "You know," Dorothy said during one of our calls, "it's strange how something so awful can lead to something good. If Brandon hadn't stolen from both of us, we never would have met." She was right. In losing my relationship with Claire, I'd gained something I hadn't expected: real friendship with someone who understood what I'd been through, who didn't see me as a resource to be exploited or a problem to be managed. Chester seemed to sense the change in our household's atmosphere. He was more relaxed, more playful, less anxious about strangers coming to the door. Dogs know when their pack is safe. I still miss the daughter I thought I had. I grieve for the relationship Claire and I might have had if she'd been capable of honesty and genuine love. But I don't miss the constant anxiety, the financial pressure, the walking on eggshells around someone who saw my affection as weakness to be exploited. 3 weeks ago, I received a letter from Claire. She's living in a halfway house, working as a receptionist at a dental office, attending court-mandated therapy sessions twice a week. The letter was different from any communication I'd received from her in years. No demands, no manipulation, no emotional blackmail. Just a simple acknowledgement that she'd hurt me, and a request to possibly have coffee together when she completed her parole requirements. I haven't decided whether I'll respond. The therapist I've been seeing, yes, at 70 years old, I finally started therapy, says I shouldn't feel pressured to rebuild a relationship with someone who caused me so much harm, even if that someone is my daughter. He says forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation, that I can let go of my anger without opening myself up to further abuse. Maybe someday Claire and I will find a way to have a relationship built on honesty and mutual respect. Maybe she'll genuinely change, genuinely understand the damage she caused, genuinely commit to becoming someone worthy of trust. But that's not my responsibility anymore. My responsibility is to protect the peace I've found, to nurture the relationships that feed my soul rather than drain it, to enjoy whatever years I have left without constantly looking over my shoulder for the next crisis or manipulation. This morning, as I sit in my garden with Chester at my feet and the autumn sun warming my face, I realize something profound. I'm happy. Not the desperate, anxious happiness that comes from temporarily avoiding conflict, but the deep, settled contentment that comes from knowing who you are and refusing to apologize for it. At 70 years old, I finally learned the difference between being loved and being used. I've learned that family isn't about blood or obligation, it's about choosing to treat each other with kindness, honesty, and respect. Chester barks at a particularly bold squirrel, and I laugh out loud. It's a sound I haven't heard from myself in years. My phone rings. Dorothy's name on the caller ID. "Joseph," she says, "I'm making my famous apple pie this afternoon. Would you like to come over for dinner? And bring Chester. I bought him some of those treats he likes." "We'd love to," I say, and I mean it. As I hang up the phone and call Chester over to get ready for our visit, I think about the envelope that changed everything. It's still in my desk drawer, a reminder of how much evidence it sometimes takes to see the truth about people we love. But I don't need it anymore. These days, I trust my instincts. I listen to my gut. I protect my peace. And I sleep soundly every night, knowing that I chose dignity over manipulation, truth over comfortable lies, and self-respect over the desperate need to be loved by someone incapable of genuine love. At 70 years old, I've finally learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to be destroyed by someone else's selfishness. Chester wags his tail as I clip on his leash, ready for another adventure in our new, peaceful life. We're going to be just fine.